Before we start this, I would once again like to inform everyone of my new podcast that isn't just the Fast Food Thursday Patreon podcast. However, it is in German only. It's called Der Großdeutsche Podcast. I'm doing it with my mates Sito and Philip, and you will be able to find all of the relevant links in the description below. Just three guys who live in very different areas of the German-speaking world, and we're just trying to figure out how this whole podcasting thing even works. In this installment of Interesting Lives, we're going to talk about Baby Doe Tabor, who has one of the most fascinating and probably also iconic stories of the Wild West era. Born in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, somewhere in September 1854, Elizabeth Bonduelle McCourt was born not exactly into great wealth, but certainly into a family that had a good bit of money. Her father was a businessman who owned and operated the first and only theater in town, among other ventures. From a very early age, her mum was very insistent about the fact that Lizzie, as she was called, because she was so beautiful, would one day be able to pull off the ultimate career move. Marry a rich guy. She pampered her, treated her like a little princess, excluded her from having to do housework, although to be fair, she had like 10 siblings, so they were probably able to pick up the slack. Her father saw things a little different and thought that his daughter should learn a few practical skills, which is why he had her work in his clothing store. He also encouraged her to pursue a number of rather, shall we say, manly activities, which, with her being a woman in that particular time and place, were considered rather scandalous. She had an interest in riding and ice skating, and I've only found one questionable source for this, so take this one with a grain of salt: metalworking. When she was 21, there was a massive fire in Oshkosh, which essentially destroyed many of the biggest businesses in town. It was like right in that central area, and it was just one of several fires in that particular time period, which ultimately led to her family losing a lot of the wealth that they had had. Lizzie did not like this. She did not enjoy being poor. She'd been brought up to live a life of luxury and full of social engagement. That's what she was good at. She was also considered just extremely beautiful, not just by her mum at this point, which, I mean, you know, beauty standards have certainly changed, I suppose. I'm not saying she isn't cute, I'm saying she maybe isn't the most beautiful woman in the world, which is certainly what everyone at the time seemed to believe. She had no shortage of suitors, but the guy she ultimately ended up picking was someone that, I mean, it's just the worst possible outcome for her family, really. He was a Protestant. Her big blue eyes gave her the nickname Baby Doe, although let's be honest here for a second, have you ever seen a blue-eyed doe? They're dark-eyed. They have dark eyes. That's what the animal looks like, so really this is just a bit of a reach to make it fit the surname. Determined to make something out of her husband and herself, she moved to the city of Central in Colorado, where he would manage his father's mine. Back then there was a bit of a gold rush in Colorado and also other areas of the Rockies, but like mainly centered around Colorado, which turned out to be not actually as rich as promised. But as it so often turns out with gold rushes that don't actually yield all that much gold at all, they found silver instead. And lots of it. I mean, you know, other people did at least, because the mine that Harvey Doe was managing and that Baby Doe was helping him in turned out not to actually be all that rich in anything, really. And when I say help, by the way, I mean she put on the mining clothes and she went into the mine and did the hard physical labor of mining, which today would be considered odd, but back then was just absurd for a woman to do. Apparently the thing that there was most of in that mine was zinc, which, you know, isn't exactly worthless, but also not as valuable as gold and silver, and also there wasn't even that much of it in the mine. At the time, however, the failing of the mine was blamed mostly on Harvey Doe, which, to be fair, he does seem to have been rather incompetent and not particularly assertive either, which would be necessary if you're trying to not get fucked over in a mining town. Eventually, there was an accident at the mine and operating it ceased to be profitable. Harvey went to work as an employee, not an owner, at a different mine, and Baby Doe became a housewife in the much less glamorous city of Black Hawk. The thing is, because she'd never been required to do any housework as a kid, she didn't know, like, what to do, so she sort of did nothing and just walked around town all day, just looking. She did hang out at the local clothing store rather often, which is something that she did have experience with. There she became acquainted with a man called James Scandalous, by which I mean she friend-zoned him, essentially, which is fair enough. I've read conflicting sources as to whether or not she actually ever worked at the store, only that if she did, Harvey would have objected. When she became pregnant, Harvey Doe insisted that the child was probably Sans, which Baby Doe vehemently denied. The boy was ultimately stillborn, but it was the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. Baby Doe resented her husband for caging her, not putting her skills to use, and also because he wasn't skilled enough or hardworking enough to make them both rich. She would have much rather worn the expensive fabrics than having to sell them. Harvey also lost his job at the mine, which was not paying very well to begin with, and he started getting into trouble, he started getting into debt, he started seeing prostitutes, which Baby Doe found out about and filed for divorce over. So she moved to Leadville with James Scandalous, although not as a couple, he just also had a store there where she ended up working, and he was trying to woo her, although not very successfully so. She was bored, not wanting to be a clothing store clerk, and equipped with the talents of a socialite, which is what she really wanted to be doing. So she just kind of did. Leadville was the epicenter of the Colorado silver rush that had made so many lucky individuals so much money, and those were the kinds of people that Baby Doe was now mingling with. On that list was one Horace Austin Warner Tabor, who, being one of the biggest silver barons at the time, was basically the Jeff Bezos of the late 1800s. He was famous throughout the United States simply as the Silver King. Now, Horace had a very interesting life of his own up until this point. He'd moved to Colorado in order to find gold, but eventually discovered that it was actually a lot more profitable to be a sort of middleman while he let other people go on those explorations that were not only dangerous, but sometimes rather pointless. So while he was out doing prospect work and all kinds of businessman things, his wife ran a general store and a boarding house, which were actually immensely profitable. Augusta Tabor, by the way, was a very intelligent businesswoman who was almost more popular in town than her husband, being described as a kind and generous host. She was very progressive in her views, outspoken against slavery all her life, which is notable because her cousin, President Franklin Pierce, was massively anti-abolitionist, which means pro-slavery. Horace, meanwhile, pulled very successful stints as postmaster and even mayor of Leadville at the time, and he, even for a very short period of time, was the lieutenant governor of Colorado. This allowed him to make a lot of connections, forge a lot of business contacts, so eventually he began getting into the business of grub stakes. Now, a grub stake is a sort of venture capital practice where you have a bunch of people who want to go explore a claim and maybe see if they can find any valuable minerals there. So you supply them with basic capital in the form of equipment, tools, and maybe hiring some additional labor, maybe giving them a little extra cash, and then if they find anything, you own part of that forever. Now, because of how variable the results could be when it came to silver mining, prospecting, explorations, this wasn't necessarily a good investment tactic, which Augusta was very aware of and made Horace aware of several times. But the gamble paid off not once, but twice with the Little Pittsburgh and Matchless mines. So the Tabors were already very wealthy, but now they were just obscenely rich. He used just a fraction of this money to construct the Tabor Opera House and the Grand Tabor Hotel, which were connected through a secret tunnel that he used to provide discretion for all kinds of adulterous activities for his rich friends, and also rather quickly, himself, because his marriage was falling apart. You see, Augusta had become the kind of just nagging, irritating wife that was constantly demanding they diversify their investment portfolios so they actually have permanent wealth in a way that is sustainable and not just lose everything they have the second that the silver rush is over. I mean, it wasn't like the price of silver was incredibly spurious and very prone to sudden fits of line go up, line go down. And it wasn't as though the overall downward trend of the later years of the silver rush had prompted the powerful mining magnates to hit up their friends in politics to create legislation that would help them keep their fortunes. It's really weird how things were completely different back then than they are today. Into this household situation in the year 1880 introduce Baby Doe. First night they met, he gave her the equivalent of $130,000 US today. Imagine being so attractive that a motherfucker gives you 130 grand on the first night. He also put her up in a hotel room that was right next to James Scandalowski's shop, which must have been horrific for the guy because he did eventually, move away. This really just completely destroyed the Tabor marriage because Horace was just absolutely taken with Baby Doe, and evidently, from what you will learn later, she was also legitimately taken with him. Just for the record, Horace Tabor at this point was 50, Baby Doe was 26, claimed to be 20, and Horace's son was 27, so you see how that might even at the time have been a little bit weird. Their love affair was hardly a secret at this point. I mean, Augusta lived in a different city, and she learned of it. Horace tried to file for a divorce, not wanting to be with his wife anymore, but she actually refused it, after which Horace tried to go the legal route, sort of circumvent the laws he should maybe have followed. Got sued by Augusta for damages, which she received, until she finally met Baby Doe just once for a few minutes and realized that she had no chance of competing with this just perfect young thing that was so taken with her husband. So she finally accepted the divorce, which wasn't the end for her. She, managed to diversify her portfolio, actually became permanently and in a stable way wealthy, and ended up engaging in various business ventures and donating liberally to a lot of causes. She built a school for girls and ultimately retired into a very comfortable life as a beloved and respected socialite in Colorado and advocate of women's rights. So for her, the story kind of ultimately does have a bit of a happy ending. Horace Tabor had been appointed to the United States Senate after all this, and not because he was elected, but because a different senator was appointed to cabinet, and then they, had to fill the interim for a month or two until actual proper elections could be held again. So he decided to take this opportunity to marry Baby Doe in Washington, D.C. It was a lavish party, probably the most expensive wedding held in the United States up until that point in time, and everyone who was anyone all over the United States was invited. The sitting president, Chester Arthur, attended this wedding, held at the prestigious Willard Hotel, with Baby Doe wearing a dress and jewelry worth $100,000. The invitations to the wedding were printed in silver. However, after officiating the wedding, when the priest eventually found out that both Baby Doe and Horace Tabor were actually divorcees from different Christian denominations, he refused to sign the proper paperwork, and they had to do that a different round, which this time around wasn't illegal. It was only the very first of many hurdles they would have to overcome in high society. This marriage was an absolute scandal. I mean, sure, back then at the time it was common for a man of great wealth and status to maybe have one or two concubines. That happened. That was morally accepted. You didn't tell your wife about it, of course. Tried for her not to find out, but the main thing was that you wouldn't endanger your marriage over it. You wouldn't go ahead and divorce the woman who had stood by you and helped you build your empire. This was a threat to the way of life of pretty much all of the powerful women at the time, the mighty socialites that were the wives of these incredibly wealthy men, so they barreled down on it hard. The Tabors were not invited to any of the higher social events in Denver, none of the societies, the charities, nothing. They were completely excluded. So they made their own social events. They threw massive parties almost every weekend in their massive mansion, inviting anyone who wanted to join. They didn't need to care if the rest of the aristocracy liked them. They were the richest people in the western United States, and they were liberal with their cash. Baby Doe spending much of it on jewelry, clothes, and horses, but also real estate, which she provided rent-free to the women's rights movement at the time. A lot of the people at the time blamed Baby Doe solely as the evil destroyer of the Tabor marriage with her womanly powers of youth, but anyone who actually knew them understood that they did genuinely love each other. One person in particular mentioned that Baby Doe must have really loved Horace a lot to be this physically close to him this much of the time, because he bathed like twice a year and he was not leading a particularly sedentary lifestyle. Even at his age, he was very active. They had two daughters, Elizabeth Bonduelle Lilly and Rosemary Echo Silver Dollar Honeymaid, which I'm not even making this up. Her actual name that she chose to go by in public was Silver Dollar or Silver, also often. And apparently, Baby Doe was a good mum, giving her daughters a lot of time and attention, and apparently once again defied gender norms by breastfeeding in public. In 1890, the silver rush was coming to an end as the price of mining silver began drastically increasing while the availability had driven down the value. The influence of the silver miners prompted the federal government subsidy program called the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which forced the Treasury to purchase a certain amount of silver in order to ensure the price of silver remained high and the mining magnate buddies could continue turning a profit on the taxpayer's dime. Now, this did stabilize the price of silver, but there was a major problem, because the government was buying this silver at above market rates. So they were paying more for it than other people in the silver metal market. So investors from all over the world bought silver and sold it to the US government. Thing is, you could also exchange US dollars for gold, and the gold that you would get in exchange for a certain amount of US dollars was worth more on the metal market than the silver that the United States would purchase. So they bought silver, sold it to the government, traded in their dollars for gold that was worth more than the silver, bought more silver, sold it to the US government, and so on and so forth. This not only meant that the US government's gold reserves were rapidly depleting, it also meant that there was a big bubble of silver, which they weren't necessarily super aware of at the time because of how monetary theory, how advanced it was, but they did repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1893, which made that bubble burst and created a massive financial crisis that affected all sectors of the economy. This just evaporated the Tabor fortune like this. It was just gone because, of course, Horace had not followed Augusta's advice and had not diversified his assets and was also still sort of investing tons into the silver that wasn't really valuable anymore. So while he was out there scrambling all over the place to secure new business deals and protect the fortune that he was so rapidly losing, Baby Doe was trying to save the local operations of the various different mines, save the family fortune at the home front. She sold a lot of her jewelry, which, it being made of silver, was also now massively depreciated in value. They had to sell off mining stakes, real estate. They even had their utilities turned off at the mansion because they could no longer afford to pay the bills. Unwilling, probably because of shame, to admit their sudden poverty, even in front of her own daughters, Baby Doe would pretend that it was all just a big game, that they were pretending to be poor for fun. Within months, they had lost everything, went from being some of the richest people in the country to living in a boarding house for the poor. Horace was toiling in one of the few remaining silver mines somewhere as a laborer. But the Tabors had been good to Denver, especially Baby Doe had given a lot of money to charity as a philanthropist, which she was. So Denver remembered that, and Horace was once again appointed postmaster, which meant that they could move into a small apartment, and though they were no longer starving, they were still very, very poor. Friends were lending them money, knowing full well that they would never get it back. Now, this is a big point of evidence as to the fact that Baby Doe genuinely did love Horace Tabor, because at this time she was in her mid-40s, but still so beautiful that she had a lot of suitors. A lot of very, very rich people still wanted to marry her, still propositioned her to abandon her husband and get with them, and she denied all of them. Which would have been rather similar to the situation that happened with her first husband, but it did not. On his deathbed in 1899, all Horace Tabor had left was the matchless mine, and he told Baby Doe to keep it in ship shape, because the second that silver bounced back from this temporary problem that had been happening for many years and there had been like a trend and everyone was able to foresee. But the moment it bounces back, it will make her millions. That never happened, of course, but Horace Tabor sort of never really learned that it's a good idea to diversify your assets and not put all of your eggs in one basket. Not to mention, right, they also kind of just didn't own that mine anymore. It was no longer operational. But to be fair, it seemed as though nobody actually owned it, so Baby Doe was able to just move back to Leadville and move into a cabin right next to it, trying to find investors and even attempt to work it herself, which was very bad idea given the dilapidated safety conditions of the structure. She was trying hard to revitalize the mine, but she could barely even feed herself and her daughters. The only reason she was able to buy food at all was because her family from Wisconsin was sending money to the grocery store. The very last thing she sold was her wedding necklace, but even that wasn't enough. Her eldest daughter Lily eventually moved up to Wisconsin to be with the family there and pick up, a very stable, respectable, good life with her cousin. Yeah. Silver Dollar, meanwhile, also eventually moved out, making her way to Chicago after a failed writing career, making money as a burlesque showgirl and the mistress of various gangsters, until she descended into alcoholism and died in 1925, apparently after pouring boiling water over herself while drunk, which, yes, that does sound very suspicious, and most people did not believe it, including Baby Doe herself, although there it was that she was convinced that her daughter was not dead at all. Baby Doe was sort of descending into a little bit of madness, which is hardly surprising given the circumstances she lived under and the things that had happened to her. She was essentially squatting in an abandoned silver mine that had once made her one of the richest women in the entire world, and writing these long, winding diary entries about how she had to suffer now to pay for the vanity that she had exuded, lived with, been really an incarnation of during the time where she'd been so very wealthy. A lot of people still knew her, still liked her, but she wanted nothing to do with them. She chose to be in isolation. As we all know, the isolation, that's not very healthy for your mental health. Her mind deteriorated really alongside just Leadville itself because, it was going from a boomtown to a ghost town because Silver never really returned. She would walk around the streets at night with a big wooden cross around her neck, never accepting anyone's help for anything, but always willing to help others. She'd guide people around the mountain who were lost, even sometimes letting them into her home on cold winter nights so they could get some food and some warmth in a time when she was barely able to feed herself. On the 7th of March 1935, no smoke was coming out of the chimney of the cabin she was living in. Some neighbors decided to investigate the situation and found Baby Doe Tabor frozen to the ground of her cabin, surrounded by meager scraps of nothing and old newspapers. She was 81 at the time when she died. Her body was brought to Denver, the funeral paid for by some of her old wealthy friends. She was in many ways emblematic of her times, like rising from rags to riches and then just plummeting permanently into abject poverty, which she stayed in for the rest of her existence. She was progressive, resilient, intelligent, charismatic, and a mystery to many of her contemporaries. She was a woman who decided to go her own way and paid the price of that at the time. After her death, generally she is remembered very positively. She was induced into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame, like Augusta Tabor, by the way, also independently of that for the achievements that she had done, which, the press at the time was very, very negative about Baby Doe Tabor and her husband. And the thing is, just to contextualize this, think about all of the things that happened in this story. And it's really, in our modern times, it would be like Kim Kardashian living in some old sound studio that Kanye used to own before he died. I know that all of these end in a downer because they all end in the death of the person. That's how the life of these people worked. That is how this series of, interesting lives works. But with this one, I can't help but be left with a feeling of just it hits different, you know? It's like this downward spiral of despair that came so suddenly and that was so inescapable and that she just like put up with at the end. It's really, I don't know, that's something that will probably stay with me for a while. Thank you very much for watching this installment of Interesting Lives. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, diversify your portfolios. I'm not even joking, man. Just fucking do it. It's very important. And see you around, cunts.